While my sister smiled in her white wedding dress, my father handed me an envelope that erased me from the family. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Bryn Vale, and I still remember how cold my father's voice sounded that day. Selah's wedding was being held at a huge country club outside the city. Everyone looked happy, laughing and taking pictures, while I felt completely out of place the moment I arrived. My father, Orson, barely greeted me. He simply told me to follow him somewhere private before the ceremony started. We walked into a small hallway near the ballroom. Without even looking at me properly, he handed me a thick envelope. I opened it and realized it was a legal document saying I was no longer part of the family. My hand started shaking while he accused me of leaving them behind years ago after my mother passed away. He said I only cared about myself and never supported the family. What hurt the most was seeing Selah standing nearby in her wedding dress, hearing every word, yet saying nothing to defend me. She just lowered her eyes like I didn't matter. A few relatives noticed what was happening and began staring at me like I was some stranger causing problems on an important day. I felt embarrassed and angry at the same time. For a moment, I wanted to walk out and never come back. But I stopped myself because they had no idea I came prepared. Inside my purse was another file filled with documents connected to my late mother's estate. My father thought he could publicly destroy me without consequences. He didn't know the truth was already sitting in my hands. After my mother died, our house stopped feeling like a home. Everything changed so fast that sometimes it felt like I had lost both parents at the same time. My father barely spoke to me unless he was criticizing something I did. If bills were late, it was somehow my fault. If Selah got upset, he blamed me for stressing her out. No matter what happened in that house, I became the easiest person to blame. Selah slowly turned into the center of my father's world. He treated her carefully, bought her expensive gifts, and praised her for the smallest things. Meanwhile, I felt invisible. At dinner, they would make plans without including me. Family photos were taken without asking where I was. I started spending more time alone in my room because silence hurt less than their cold behavior. School became my escape. I worked hard because I knew education was the only way out. I stayed up late studying while working part-time jobs after class. When I finally earned a scholarship to a college in another state, I felt proud of myself for the first time in years. But my father ruined that moment too. Instead of congratulating me, he accused me of running away from family responsibilities. After I moved, he told relatives and neighbors that I abandoned them during hard times. Some people stopped talking to me completely because they believed his version of the story. Selah never corrected anyone. She let people think I was selfish while she stayed close to our father and enjoyed being the favorite daughter. Years passed without real contact between us. Then suddenly, a wedding invitation arrived at my apartment. The message sounded polite, but something about it felt strange. My father never reached out unless he wanted something. Deep down, I knew that invitation wasn't about rebuilding family bonds. It felt like they were pulling me back into something painful all over again. The rehearsal dinner was held the night before the wedding at a private restaurant overlooking the lake. The moment I walked inside, something felt wrong. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, fresh white roses covered every table, and servers carried expensive bottles of champagne around the room. Even the musicians playing near the entrance looked like they belonged at a celebrity event. I stood there quietly trying to understand how my father could afford any of it. A few years earlier, he had complained constantly about money. He used to call me asking for help with utility bills and repairs around the house. Yet now he was acting like some wealthy businessman hosting the wedding of the year. Guests kept praising him all evening. I heard people saying things like, "Orson really gave Selah her dream wedding," and "what an amazing father." Every compliment made my stomach tighten because none of it made sense. My father was smiling proudly, shaking hands, and soaking in all the attention like he wanted everyone to admire him. Selah barely spoke to me the entire night. Whenever I tried to catch her eye, she quickly looked away or found an excuse to walk somewhere else. Her behavior felt nervous, almost guilty. It was obvious she knew something I didn't. While standing near the dessert table, I overheard two older relatives talking about me in low voices. One of them said I should stop being stubborn and apologize to my father before he removed me from the family completely. The other agreed and called me ungrateful for leaving home years ago. Hearing strangers judge me based on lies hurt more than I expected. I wanted to defend myself, but I stayed quiet and listened. The more I watched my father that night, the more convinced I became that this wedding was built on secrets. Nothing about the situation felt honest. Beneath the fancy decorations and smiling faces, there was tension everywhere, and I could feel it growing heavier by the hour. The wedding reception started like nothing was wrong. Guests laughed, glasses clinked together, and soft music filled the ballroom. Selah and her husband were dancing while photographers followed them around capturing every happy moment. I stayed near the back of the room, trying not to draw attention to myself. After the strange rehearsal dinner, I already felt uncomfortable being there. Later that evening, my father walked toward the stage with a champagne glass in his hand. Everyone quieted down, expecting a sweet speech about the bride and groom. At first, he sounded emotional as he talked about family, loyalty, and sacrifice. Some guests even wiped away tears while listening to him. Then suddenly, his tone changed. He looked directly at me in front of the entire room and said, "Not every child values family the way Selah does." The room became silent so fast it felt hard to breathe. My father started describing me as selfish and cold, claiming I abandoned the family after my mother died and never looked back. Every sentence was carefully designed to make me sound heartless. Before I could react, he pulled an envelope from inside his suit jacket and walked toward my table. My chest tightened when I recognized the papers. He handed them to me in front of everyone and announced that I was officially removed from the family and would receive nothing from his estate. Gasps spread across the ballroom. People stared at me with shock, curiosity, and judgment. Some guests whispered to each other while others avoided looking at me completely. I felt frozen in my chair, humiliated in a room full of strangers and relatives. What hurt most was Selah. She stood beside her new husband holding her bouquet, watching everything happen without saying a word. She didn't defend me or stop our father. She simply stayed silent while I became the villain of the night. At that moment, I realized the humiliation had been planned long before I ever arrived at that wedding. I couldn't stay inside that ballroom another second. The whispers, the stares, and the fake sympathy on people's faces were too much. I walked out through the back doors of the venue and stepped into the cold night air, trying hard not to cry. My hands were still shaking from the papers my father forced on me in front of everyone. For a few minutes, I just stood there near the parking lot, listening to distant music from inside the building. Then something my mother once told me suddenly came back to my mind. Years before she died, she looked at me very seriously and said, "Never trust paperwork that comes from your father alone." At the time, I didn't understand why she said it. That memory stayed buried for years until recently. A few months before the wedding, I had gone to clear out an old storage unit that belonged to my mother. Most of it contained ordinary things like winter clothes, photo albums, and boxes filled with books. But hidden behind an old cabinet, I found a locked metal case. Inside were folders full of legal documents, bank records, and property papers. At first, none of it made sense. I spent weeks reading through everything carefully. Eventually, I realized my mother had created a private trust shortly before she became sick. The trust listed me as the main beneficiary. The family house, several investment accounts, and other valuable assets were tied directly to it. What shocked me most was seeing payments connected to Selah's wedding venue. My father had been using money linked to that trust without ever telling me. Suddenly, his expensive lifestyle and the luxury wedding made perfect sense. That discovery was the reason I contacted a lawyer months ago. I didn't tell anyone because I needed proof before confronting my family. Standing outside the reception that night, I finally understood why my father wanted to publicly cut me out. He was trying to scare me before I exposed what he had been hiding for years. I stayed outside near the empty garden behind the venue, trying to calm myself down after what happened inside. My phone kept buzzing with messages from relatives, but I ignored every single one. I already knew none of them wanted to hear my side of the story. They only believed what my father told them. Finally, I called the one person who actually listened to me over the last few months, my attorney, Taryn Pike. He answered immediately, almost like he had been expecting my call. The moment he heard my voice, he asked if my father had already made his move at the wedding. That question alone told me everything. I explained what happened during the reception, and Taryn went quiet for a second before telling me there was more I needed to know. He had spent months reviewing bank transfers, property records, and old financial statements connected to my mother's trust. According to him, my father had been taking money from those accounts for years. The wedding wasn't paid for with his own savings like everyone believed. The venue, the catering, the decorations, even some of Selah's honeymoon expenses had been covered using money that legally belonged to me. On top of that, my father used trust funds to keep his failing business alive after falling deep into debt. Then Taryn revealed something that hurt worse than anything else that night. Selah knew where the money came from. She had seen documents months ago and still went along with everything. That explained why she avoided me during the rehearsal dinner and why she stayed silent during my humiliation. Suddenly, the wedding invitation made sense. They didn't invite me because they missed me or wanted peace. They needed me there to pressure me into signing more papers. If I reacted emotionally or felt guilty enough, they hoped I would give up the rest of the trust without asking questions. Instead of feeling weak, I felt anger building inside me. For the first time in years, I realized I wasn't trapped anymore. I finally had proof, and they had no idea how much I already knew. I stood outside for several minutes staring at the lights shining through the ballroom windows. Earlier that night, I felt embarrassed and completely alone. But after speaking with Taryn, something inside me changed. My father expected me to leave quietly after humiliating me in front of everyone. He thought shame would keep me silent like it always had before. This time was different. I opened my purse and looked at the file my lawyer prepared for me. Every document inside it carried proof of what my father had done over the years. My hands were steady now. I wasn't scared anymore. When I walked back into the ballroom, conversation slowly stopped. People noticed me immediately because most of them probably thought I had already left in tears. The music continued for a moment before fading into awkward silence. I could feel dozens of eyes following me as I crossed the room. My father was standing near the head table talking to guests when he saw me approaching. The confident smile on his face disappeared almost instantly. Selah looked nervous the second our eyes met. Her husband, Dorian, looked confused because he clearly had no idea what was happening anymore. I stopped directly in front of them holding the folder against my chest. The room became so quiet that even the photographers lowered their cameras. I looked at my father calmly and said, "If we're sharing documents tonight, let's share all of them." Nobody moved. I pulled out several copies from the folder and handed one to my father, one to Selah, and one to Dorian. My father refused to take it at first, but I left the papers on the table in front of him anyway. Dorian opened his copy immediately while Selah just stared down at hers without touching it. Around us, guests started whispering again, only this time the attention wasn't focused on me. My father's face slowly lost color as he realized exactly what was inside those pages. For the first time that night, he looked nervous instead of powerful. And deep down, I knew the wedding he worked so hard to control was about to completely fall apart. Dorian flipped through the papers slowly at first, but the deeper he read, the more serious his expression became. The documents included bank transfers, property records, and signed financial agreements connected to my mother's trust. There were highlighted sections showing money being removed from accounts that legally belonged to me. Every page carried dates, signatures, and official records that were impossible to explain away. My father immediately tried to act calm. He claimed the papers were fake and accused me of ruining Selah's wedding out of jealousy. But nobody in the room looked convinced anymore. The confidence he carried earlier that night had completely disappeared. Guests who once supported him were now staring at him with confusion and suspicion. Dorian suddenly asked a question that changed the entire atmosphere. He wanted to know why the wedding venue payments were connected to my trust account. My father couldn't answer properly. He kept talking in circles, blaming accountants and old financial mistakes, but his excuses sounded weak. Then Dorian found another document showing unpaid business loans linked to my father's company. Part of the trust money had been used to cover those debts too. The room became tense as people realized this wasn't some family argument anymore. This was fraud. Selah finally started crying quietly beside him. At first, she tried to deny everything, but the pressure in the room became too heavy. She admitted she had known about the trust for months. She said our father convinced her it would all work out eventually and begged her not to say anything before the wedding. Hearing that hurt more than my father's betrayal. Selah looked at me through tears and admitted she stayed silent because she was terrified the wedding would fall apart if the truth came out. She chose protecting her perfect day over protecting me. Dorian stepped away from the head table looking completely shaken. Guests began whispering louder, and several people quietly gathered their things to leave early. The celebration that once looked beautiful now felt cold and uncomfortable. My father spent years making me look like the selfish daughter. But standing there in front of everyone, the truth finally spoke louder than his lies ever could. The ballroom no longer felt like a wedding reception. The music had stopped completely, and the happy energy from earlier was gone. Small groups of guests stood whispering near the tables while others quietly grabbed their coats and headed toward the exits. Nobody wanted to stay in the middle of such a public disaster. Earlier that night, many of those same people looked at me like I was the problem. Some avoided me, while others judged me without knowing the truth. Now their attention had turned toward my father. I could see the shock on their faces as they realized how much he had lied over the years. A few relatives even walked over to me to ask if I was okay, but their sudden kindness felt fake after everything they believed about me. Near the dance floor, Dorian's parents were speaking angrily with my father. Their voices became louder with every minute. They were furious after learning that money connected to fraud may have helped pay for the wedding. Dorian himself looked completely drained, like he no longer recognized the family he had just married into. My father stepped away several times to answer phone calls, but nobody seemed willing to help him anymore. I noticed his business partners ignoring his calls one after another. The confident man who enjoyed humiliating me in front of everyone was now sweating and struggling to stay calm. Finally, he walked over to me with panic written all over his face. His voice sounded softer than I had ever heard before. He begged me not to involve the courts and asked me to settle everything privately as a family. He claimed public legal action would destroy his reputation and ruin Selah's marriage before it even started. For years, he never cared about protecting my dignity. He embarrassed me, lied about me, and treated me like I didn't belong in my own family. Now that the truth was finally out, he suddenly wanted mercy. I looked directly at him and told him no. Calmly and clearly. After everything he had done, I was finished protecting people who never protected me. The reception was nearly over by the time I walked outside again. Most guests had already left, and the parking lot was quiet except for a few workers cleaning up decorations near the entrance. I was standing beside my car when I heard heels moving quickly behind me. It was Selah. Her makeup was ruined from crying, and she looked exhausted. For a second, neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other under the dim parking lot lights like complete strangers instead of sisters. Then she finally apologized. Her voice shook while she explained that she never wanted things to happen this way. She said our father controlled everything after Mom died and that she spent years trying to keep peace in the family. According to her, staying close to him felt safer than fighting him. She admitted she depended on his approval so much that she ignored things she knew were wrong. I listened quietly, but inside, old memories kept coming back. I remembered birthdays when nobody called me. Holidays where I sat alone in my apartment while they celebrated together without me. Times I reached out to Selah hoping we could fix our relationship, only for my messages to go unanswered for weeks. The hardest memory to forget was still from earlier that night. My father stood in front of hundreds of people humiliating me, and Selah said absolutely nothing. She watched me get treated like a stranger and chose silence because protecting her wedding mattered more than protecting her sister. Selah kept crying while telling me she was scared everything would fall apart if she spoke up sooner. Maybe that was true. Maybe she really did feel trapped between me and our father. But pain doesn't disappear just because someone had reasons for causing it. For years, I thought betrayal only came from cruel words or obvious lies. That night, I realized silence could hurt even more. Sometimes the deepest wound comes from the person who watches you suffer and decides not to stop it. I looked at Selah for a long moment before quietly telling her that some damage can't be undone once trust is gone. The weeks after the wedding were chaotic for everyone involved. Once lawyers and investigators started reviewing the financial records, my father's entire life began falling apart piece by piece. People who once respected him no longer wanted anything connected to his name. His business lost clients quickly, and several partners cut ties with him to avoid being dragged into the legal mess. Court notices started arriving almost every week. Some were connected to the trust money he used without permission, while others involved debts he had hidden for years. The pressure became too much for him to control. I heard from relatives that he stopped attending community events because people constantly whispered about the scandal behind his back. Selah's marriage also changed almost immediately after the wedding night. Dorian struggled to trust her after learning she kept such huge secrets from him. Arguments between them became common, especially once lawyers from his family became involved. What should have been the happiest time of their lives turned into stress, tension, and endless accusations. A few months later, I heard that most of their wedding photos were still sitting untouched inside boxes. They never hung them in their home because those pictures only reminded them of lies, humiliation, and broken trust. Meanwhile, my own life slowly became calmer. With Taryn's help, I legally reclaimed control over the remaining estate funds and my mother's property. Walking back into the family home for the first time in years felt emotional. So many painful memories lived inside those walls, yet for once, I didn't feel like an unwanted guest there anymore. I spent days cleaning out old rooms and going through my mother's belongings carefully. Instead of sadness, I finally felt peace. The house no longer belonged to the people who tried to erase me from the family. For years, my father controlled my life through guilt, lies, and fear. But now his power over me was gone completely. I wasn't carrying anger every day anymore. I was simply free, and after everything that happened, freedom felt more valuable than revenge ever could. Several months passed before I finally felt ready to visit my mother's grave again. Life had become quieter after the court cases ended, but some wounds still stayed heavy inside me. On a cold afternoon, I drove to the cemetery carrying two things in my bag: the disownment letter my father handed me at the wedding and a copy of the final court ruling that restored everything taken from me. The cemetery was peaceful and nearly empty. I stood in front of my mother's grave for a long time without speaking. So much had changed since the day she died. For years, I believed losing her destroyed our family. Later, I realized the family had already been falling apart long before she left us. I carefully placed the court papers beside the flowers I brought for her. The ruling confirmed that the trust belonged to me and that the stolen assets had to be returned. Seeing it in writing gave me a sense of closure I never expected to feel. My father spent years trying to convince everyone I was selfish and ungrateful, yet the truth finally proved otherwise. Then I took out the disownment letter. The same paper that once made me feel worthless now looked small and meaningless in my hands. I carried a lighter with me and slowly burned the letter beside the grave. I watched the edges curl into ash until nothing remained. Even after everything, my father and Selah still tried contacting me. Sometimes they left long voicemails asking for forgiveness or another chance to talk. Other times they blamed me for ruining the family. I stopped listening after a while. Not every relationship deserves to be repaired just because people regret their actions later. The greatest victory wasn't watching them lose money or reputation. It wasn't revenge or public embarrassment. My real victory was surviving years of lies without becoming bitter myself. I exposed the truth, reclaimed my life, and finally walked away with my dignity still intact. Do you think I made the right decision by cutting ties with my father and sister after everything they did, or should I have forgiven them and tried again? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more emotional stories like mine.